Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, where we look at the business of, regulation, and security for all things encrypted, digital assets, blockchain technology, privacy, and smart contracts. Hope you'll join us while we explore these forces that are shaping the economy. So this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy, and today I'm joined by Marc Boiron. He is the General Counsel of dYdX, a DeFi platform. Before that, he's recently in that role, just since February, actually. Before that, he's got a history of being with a number of law firms, most recently Manat Phelps, as a blockchain and securities attorney. So he's deep in the space. I've gotten to know him, and he's a real thinker, and I'm really excited to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks for having me here, Eric. I'm excited.
So did I leave anything out in the general introduction? You want to add a little bit to that? I'll let you tell your own story.
No, there's a pretty good intro, but overall, I've been in the space for about 4 years and pretty much exclusively working in crypto, which has been a bunch of fun. But it was only until about 3 months ago that I was outside counsel helping a bunch of different companies, and now I get to focus on one, which makes things a little bit easier.
There you go. Great. You're also involved in some publications, right? Like the FinTech Year in Review in 2020 and some others. Want to add anything to that in terms of your bibliography?
No, I mean, I used to honestly do a lot more writing, and at a certain point, I start looking at everyone else, and I go, "How do you do so much while also helping out clients?" So that's taken a little bit of a back, kind of like step back compared to the advising I've been doing, but I do enjoy writing some.
Yeah, I like writing too. Although I got to say, when you do the podcast, it's sort of a different level altogether. But it allows much more interaction than that solo writing. But I still write too. So anyway, you went from Manat Phelps, you went to dYdX. What changed?
Yeah. So when I was outside counsel, I basically, worked kind of as outside general counsel for most companies. So company would come and they'd say, here's what I want to do. And it would always have to do with crypto in one way or another. A lot of it was DeFi related. I want to launch this protocol. What do I need to do? So it's basically helping them across the board with issues, right? The basic issues of let's get companies set up and let's deal with how to get employees, equity in the company. And then it also went into, well, what about all the regulatory issues that are going to arise because of this network? And what about, any kind of token issuances that we might do? All of those things are things that I just dealt with on a day-to-day basis. And now I get to basically at dYdX do those exact same things, right? Worry about kind of the gamut of, IP and employment issues and regulatory issues, doing all of that now for, with, I guess, almost you could say 16 clients being all employees of the company.
It's interesting, when you think of like the digital asset legal space, it's not like it's one body of law. It's almost like just another ecosystem with all the same legal issues, but different.
Yeah. It is so funny because before I got into crypto, I would focus, to your point, on one body of law, right? And I knew it really well, and it's what I did. And once you get into crypto, right, and a lot of what you do when you're focusing on that one body of law is like getting into the details of like compliance things and how you do this and that. When you get into crypto, a lot of it, frankly, because of the nature of how crypto works is, okay, why is it that these regulations don't apply? Or how can we structure things so that these regulations don't apply? And the answer is sometimes they do apply and you need to do something about it. But a lot of the times it's about structuring around them. And what that brings is like, okay, well, there's a bunch of issues, but really you don't need to know like the 1,000 pages of this law. You really just need to know these 2 pages, which tell you, does this law apply and when does it apply and how does it not apply? And focus on getting those done. And if you focus on those across kind of that range of different regulations, you can actually get pretty good across the board. You just need to know when it is time to hand it off to like the deep experts on, say, commodities laws, rather than trying to handle it all.
All right. Well put. So let's talk a little bit about automated market makers, interest rate protocols, and other DeFi. What regulatory regimes actually apply to those?
Do you want me to spend the next hour talking about it?
No, just him. Just give us a laundry list.
Yeah. So I think there's a bunch of them that just every time you take a look at and you say, do these apply? So the basic easy ones, right? Securities laws. And when you take the securities laws, frankly, there's a few bodies of laws there, right? So does the Securities Act apply in terms of some issuance of a security? Does the Exchange Act apply, whether that's going to be secondary transfers or exchanges themselves of securities? Then what you're seeing more, I think these days in DeFi, brings up issues around potentially investment companies and Investment Advisor Act issues, all still kind of in the securities law realm. So all of those are things that you need to, at a threshold level, say which ones of those apply, and then where do we need to take a deeper dive? Then once you get past the securities laws, then you say, okay, well, what about commodities laws, right? So we know that the CFTC's view is that every crypto is a commodity.
I think onions, right?
Same
two exceptions.
Pretty much like everything. It's really hard to escape the commodities law kind of category. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter because the CFTC really just regulates derivatives, right? And so you need to take a look and say, what are we doing with derivatives? And if we are, does that mean we need to register as, an exchange, which, in the commodities law world would be, something like a designated contract market or swap execution facility. And so you need to take a look at those issues. Then when you kind of go one step over, you say, okay, we've looked at commodities laws, we've looked at securities laws, what else is there? And then you get to the world that people call just KYC in general, which really should be broken up into two, right? One is the Bank Secrecy Act and your obligations as a money services business or a money transmitter. Does that apply? And that's something that's been, people know that better and better these days. It's been talked about a lot, given news with, FinCEN's proposed rules in December and things like that. And so that's one body of law, and you need to look at how does that apply to you. And then you've got, on the other side of KYC is OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. And that's the sanctions regime in the US, basically saying who can you do business with and, who can you enter into financial transactions with or facilitate financial transactions for. So you need to look at that. How do you deal with that? Once you get past that, you get to consumer protection laws. That's something that's been so widely ignored in the space. And I think it's because we've got such deeper issues to deal with beyond how do we disclose this issue properly. But I think ultimately, especially as mainstream kind of comes into crypto becomes more mainstream, I think you're going to start seeing this world actually become more important when it comes to consumer protection. When, you've got, random people who are used to using a very simple, a PayPal experience, suddenly the level of disclosure that's going to be required is going to be different. And so that ends up being relevant. And then you start getting to depending on the protocol, you start getting to a whole different bodies of law, whether it's, do you look at insurance laws? Do you look at lending laws? Suddenly all of those other laws are potentially applicable. So there's such a wide spectrum of things that need to be considered. And frankly, ultimately, you've got at least 4 of those bodies of laws that will apply almost every time. The question's just, how much of an issue are they?
Right. Well put. So from the context of the dYdX or any DeFi exchange, what actually worries you in terms of regulatory uncertainty the most? Yeah. I mean, I guess almost everything. What worries you the most?
I think, look, securities law is the easy one, right? Because it's we already know there's a ton of uncertainty in the securities law world. But in a way, it's manageable. The problem is, how do you manage it while weighing the business risks associated with not doing something, right? It's pretty easy to have an exchange that just has, ETH and some stable coins on there, right? It's okay, well, I'm not really worried about the securities laws. But once you start expanding, beyond that, mostly for business reasons, you're usually going to run into issues. So weighing kind of how far you want to push the envelope when you've got an uncertain securities law regime is one aspect that I think is hard to navigate. Beyond that, really the big ones are all the things around, AML and KYC. And so I'll lump in both the Bank Secrecy Act and OFAC into one. I think FinCEN has actually done a good job when it comes to giving guidance. Its 2019 guidance was actually with a few areas of uncertainty, especially around like dApps. Like they did a pretty good job, but it's really a concern of like what is going to come down the pike like sometime in the near future, as in like what we saw in December. And then you've got OFAC, which, you know, broadly applies to like just US people doing business with certain people or countries. And, you know, in a DeFi network, you know, it's very difficult to control that. And there's arguments to be made that like the networks wouldn't be regulated by OFAC, but the front end will. But even on the front end, like you start creating a lot of friction once you start adding in, you know, the typical KYC that you see in like everyday life when you want to deal with any kind of financial institution. You know, dealing with that in DeFi, frankly, would be a killer for most DeFi protocols and the companies behind them. And so that's something that I think is definitely probably more on my mind than anything else, is like how to navigate that in a compliant way that doesn't create friction for users and still keeps like a good user experience.
And you haven't mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, which is being on the horizon. I mean, obviously not governing, you know, we have FinCEN for that, but how much of a risk do you see that being, particularly, you know, it seems that in a lot of their guidance, you know, they continue to refer to whether it's dApps or stablecoins under this premise of so-called. They kind of almost refuse to acknowledge it, which is almost on some level, dare I say, a little childish, but it is what it is. But what kind of risks do you see? I mean, they released some more guidance in March. There's a lot of clarification. It seems like almost every time you turn the page on it, they're sort of raising these risks. And not only are they raising these risks, they're not being clear about them. They're almost sort of saying, well, you know, it's almost like the setup for like, I told you to do all these things, but then like when they say, oh, here are you have to do things from you have to assess the risk or what have you, there's no guidance there. It's just simply, you have the obligation, but we're not going to be clear about what you actually have to do to navigate these treacherous waters that we just, you know, set sail in for you.
Yeah, you know, FATF's an interesting one because it does just make recommendations to countries. And so, you know, when you think of it in that sense, it's like, okay, well, the countries can then decide what to do. The problem is that most countries, especially the smaller countries, but many of them around the world, will just go ahead and adopt whatever it is that FATF recommends. And when you look at what FATF recommends, it really lacks, I think, in precision in terms of like how they're thinking about things. So when I think about it from the perspective of like a DeFi protocol, like how does this apply? Well, you know, they go out and they define a VASP, which is a virtual asset service provider. And basically what they try doing is imposing liability to report certain things on effectively anyone who develops a protocol and then somehow in any way whatsoever stays involved with it, if it's going to do anything in the financial realm. Like I'm really simplifying that, but that's like generally the idea is like, and if you look at the point of a DeFi protocol, it is not to have intermediaries who are there, who are able to report on what is going on. It's literally the opposite of that. It's peer-to-peer or arguably peer-to-protocol interactions that don't involve, you know, any body there. And I think that's something that like FinCEN has gotten right. It's really focused on this idea of like, we have custodians, we've had them historically. And if there is a custodian or any custodial type of relationship, well, we're going to impose obligations, including reporting obligations through SARs. FATF doesn't really get that. It has a different perspective, and it doesn't care about the custodial nature or the existence of intermediaries at all. And so that's really where the problems are with FATF's guidance. And you know, you can even take it a step further and say, if you've got a group of token holders in a DeFi protocol, if you want to say that any of those DeFi protocols are kind of acting as, or those token holders are acting like as a business, and whether that's like a small group of like multi-sigs or, I don't know, one token holder that is a fund that acts as a business. Well, suddenly they fall under, the vast definition. And now you're going to have like thousands of people governing a protocol that all fall within the vast definition, that all have pretty much the same reporting obligations. You just quickly start seeing that it doesn't make any sense.
And so does FATF risk, as a practical matter, making itself less relevant? Like, I mean, there will always be smaller countries sort of adopting it, but without the capability of enforcing it, right? Or knowing even how to delineate, like, is that a risk that FATF takes? Will basically this vast guidance be largely ignored or just relied in part? Like, what's the risk? Because it seems like on this particular point, FATF has gone so far out that and the direction doesn't seem to be particularly encouraging. What is the risk to FATF ultimately?
Yeah, I think when you think of FATF more broadly, you start realizing why it's a real risk, right? So FATF, we talk about it just in the context of virtual assets, right? But FATF is really making recommendations across the board with respect to, financial services and institutions, right? And so, this is like the crypto part is like tiny part of what FATF makes recommendations on.
For sure.
And so, as a country, when you look at that, this isn't really the most important issue for you. It's really actually a lot of the other things that FATF focuses on and makes recommendations on that you actually probably care about. And so given that's the fact, there's a decent chance that you don't even focus in any meaningful way as a country on this virtual asset part of it, and you just go ahead and adopt it because frankly, there's more important issues to deal with. And I view that as probably being one of the most problematic issues here, which is like the focus just not being on crypto because it's not important. And therefore countries really just adopting it wholesale because that's what they're supposed to do. And they're focused on bigger issues. Now, the other part that makes this FATF recommendation particularly concerning is who drove it, right? And it was really like the US that actually drove this, right? That's the part that's concerning because what it tells you is like, well, then what's the US going to do when this recommendation that it drove comes from FATF? Is what's the US going to do in terms of adopting it? And I'd say the best thing that we have in the US to fall back on is that I think there's probably constitutional arguments against actually being able to adopt any of the aspects that basically say, hey, you developed software, and so now you're going to be on the hook for anything that happens after it in terms of from a reporting perspective. That's just something that doesn't really fly in the US, but it does fly outside of the US. And given that these are global networks, I think that alone is enough of a problem, even though the US might not adopt it.
And do you think, and maybe I'm going beyond the scope of what you're hoping to talk about, but do you think that at the core of this is really the U.S. continuing to use FATF as a way of extending dollar dominance? And by doing this, they view it as a play to assert dollar dominance and fend off a risk of a rising cryptocurrency world?
Yeah, look, I think we need to look at the U.S. strategy more holistically when answering that, right? Like, I think that the U.S. government as a whole, starting from the top, has pressure in a way that it's not had maybe ever when it comes to potential issues around the U.S. dollar. That being said, I think it's important to like keep it within kind of scope of like, okay, but what's going to replace the U.S. dollar, right? And realistically, at this point, there really are no viable alternatives for a lot of like global political reasons, right? Or it's simply like the size of the float of a currency just isn't big enough other than, frankly, the US, right? And so when you look at that, you say, okay, well, then if we're not talking about like fiat currencies that could replace the US, what else would the US be worried about? And so should it be worried about cryptocurrencies? And frankly, there's nothing to even be worried about other than Bitcoin, like realistically. And so you look at that and you say, like, we're not anywhere near Bitcoin being used in it as a global currency. I mean, you could believe what you want about Bitcoin being a currency or not and all other cryptos. But bottom line is like, at one point you will need stability in that currency, and we're not there. I am definitely not saying that I don't think Bitcoin will become stable in, I don't know what, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, and potentially be used as a currency at that point. And it is smart for the US to try to fend that off sooner rather than later. But I don't think that that is really driving a lot of this right now. I think what's driving a lot of this, frankly, is a fear of the unknown. It's also a fear of, like, we think that our only job is stopping crime and that's it, and stopping terrorists, all of which are very, very important, but which take like significant priority over anything else, including like any kind of innovation. And so to me, it's like you've got people who focus and spend their lives trying to stop, terrorist financing and other crimes. And so, yeah, if they look at something and they say, okay, this makes it harder to stop on the front end, even though it might be easier to track on the back end, well, maybe we don't like that. And so we want to stop it. And I think the important part is, yeah, but we can probably track people down better on the back end, is the part that I think is missing in a lot of these conversations.
All right. So shifting gears to another topic that I know you've been looking at is Blockstack. So Blockstack filed their 2020 annual report with the SEC, and they said, we expect this to be our last annual filing. And we no longer treating stacked tokens as U.S. securities. Now, for those that don't know, and you can fill in the blanks on some of this background, let's walk through what happened here. So back in 2019, I think it was, they did a Reg A offering, and the whole purpose of which was to allow them to effectively distribute their tokens to largely pay off their developers, and the concern that these would be deemed to be securities if they didn't go through the expense of a Reg A filing, which is, it's expensive, right? It's not a cheap affair. So Blockstacks did this, and they technically complied with the disclosure obligations during the period. And basically, like almost any project, there has to be a period. I have to close my... It always happens that somehow my landscaper likes to come by when I'm trying to tape an episode. It's like, great, could you just have the marching band run in the background as well? But at any rate, with any token project, for the listeners, it's like there's a period. If you want to get to being decentralized, you have to go through a period of managing into that decentralization over time, which is Hester Pierce's safe harbor proposal, which we're not going to get into in this episode because we're focusing on stacks. So they went through all this trouble, and then they're at the point where they're sufficiently decentralized, right? Or at least that's their opinion of Counsel. And they're no longer doing these essential managerial functions that were intended to basically take them to the point of decentralization. So now they're saying, okay, now we're no longer a security. So after 2 years, it's been great. I would love spending all the money for these filings and the lawyers and the accountant. Thanks so much. And we're on our way. So what do you think? Is that a good result for Blockstack's now hero?
Yeah, look, I think it's the right result. How you approach it really depends on your perspective. And I don't think Blockstack actually took a different strategy than what you see anyone else taking. It just, they implemented it in a different way, right? So if we take a look at like what do most projects do to get to the point where Blockstack is at now, they will definitely traditionally issue private instruments to investors as securities. They may even get to a point where they issue the token in private as a security to investors. And then they take the position that at a certain point, they're backing out from the project effectively. There are no longer going to be any, essential entrepreneurial or managerial efforts, at least not theirs. And they're going to treat their token as not being a security. The only thing is they did that in private, relying on Reg D with no kind of filing obligations with the SEC. Blockstack basically just went ahead and did the exact same thing, except they did it pursuant to a Reg A, which allowed them, instead of just having private investors, it allowed them to also have a bunch of non-accredited investors that participated in the stacks offering. The issue with that approach, though, is that you had, following their sale of stacks, now freely transferable tokens that were securities that were somehow being traded outside of the U.S. on exchanges, but weren't being traded in the U.S. Although you still had a ton of U.S. people trading them, because the secondary markets are different in terms of, like, you can't be trading a security on Coinbase unless technically it was the entity that has an ATS. But leaving that aside, and so you just had this weird dynamic that, frankly, I think was priced into stacks during that time, that I think most companies probably avoid when they're just dealing with tokens in private or dealing with instruments. So ultimately, my view is, like, that is the right outcome. I think the SEC has given guidance that specifically talks about the morphing of a digital asset from a security to a non-security. That technically isn't official SEC guidance because it's from FinHub. But if you take a look at, FinHub's like digital asset framework, and they go through their like 70 questions on how to determine whether something constitutes a security, they do have a section that specifically says, and how do you decide whether your token goes from being a security to maybe not being a security? And here's the things to consider. And I think that's effectively the framework that Blockstack followed, and that I think most of the companies in the DeFi space and crypto in general right now are following that, but they're doing it in private.
Great. And so maybe also, if they're small enough, they could also use like Reg CF, because that limit's been raised to 5 million now, and that'd certainly be a lighter lift than Reg A, which is now 75 million.
Yeah.
Listen, if there's an adoption of the Hester Pierce safe harbor framework, which gives 3 years to get to that point, it seems more logical than creating this sort of weird period of time during which the sole purpose you're actually a security is to not become a security and to get sufficiently decentralized. It just seems sort of a perverse outcome that I just, you have to question, like, how do you look at this and say, hey, this makes sense? Like, I get the Inman test and all, but still, it's sort of a bit of it's a bit of a charade when it occurs within a relatively short period. If it's like, hey, we don't know and we're in no rush, okay, 100% agreed, they should be a security.
Yeah. But you can see, like, some of the like, I'd say most of the best projects in the space who I think have issued tokens in probably the most conservative ways, they were around for a while, right? It's like the problem is when we get, and I think we're probably at that point already now in this cycle, is when we get to companies that form and want to issue a token, 3 months later, right when they launch a network, right? So if you look at like the more established DeFi protocols with tokens, they had protocols that were in existence for a year, 2 years, 3 years before they actually ever distributed a token, right? Like, there was something real there. And so I think that's probably one of the bigger differences between, like, I think where we're going to end up, hopefully, is something like that. And Purse's proposal does that. It basically says, like, build a protocol, have it out there for a while, build an ecosystem around it, and then let's treat the tokens as, not being securities, entirely, and don't have any reporting, filing obligations at all. I think that framework actually makes sense. I think the one that says, hey, we're going to issue a token 3 months after we launched a network that has no ecosystem around it whatsoever and that we're going to be developing, I think that's a little more of a struggle and, probably doesn't deserve to be treated as anything other than a security.
All right. So switching gears again, we're now going to talk about the DAO. So before we get into the Wyoming DAO statute, which basically recognized that you could form an entity that was a DAO entity, right? And a DAO stands for decentralized autonomous organization. So I guess even before getting into the benefits of creating an entity for the DAO, I'll leave it to you to sort of lay out the framework for why a DAO is important and why people implement the DAO.
Yeah. I think if you go back to like just corporate law in general, right, and how it works, right? Typically, what you think of is you've got shareholders that go ahead and vote for a board of directors. The board of directors makes these important strategic decisions, and then there are officers who go ahead and carry out exactly what is happening. And with that comes like a boatload of laws that have been established over a very long period of time, and frankly, especially in places like Delaware, work very, very well. But it's not the most efficient thing to set up. And, it's not always the most flexible thing. Now, we were to, then we'll talk about it, but like in the context of LLCs, there can be more flexibility. But nonetheless, there's a lot of like restrictions there. When you think of a DAO, it's basically like, how can a group of people come together and make decisions around a protocol in the most efficient way possible? And one of the most efficient ways possible is to not have a body that is deciding, this or that. It's to allow, all decisions to be taken on chain directly between all of the parties, right? And so, that's kind of what's been implemented if you think about it in the context of token holders. I hate to look at that and compare it to any kind of like organization as like a corporation, because what that implies is that the tokens are necessarily, effectively the equivalent of equity and therefore should be treated as stock. But that's not really true. What really should take place is a comparison to something like a partnership or a limited partnership, because effectively it looks a lot like that. And in that context, what you have is you have people who are coming together and basically saying, hey, we believe in this business. And in our case, we believe in this protocol. And we want to help it grow. And we're each individually going to act to make that happen. And that pretty much is what a DAO is. It just happens to be connected through a underlying protocol. But frankly, all of the interactions are still in like meat space, right? It's not like there's some like magic protocol that like makes all the decisions because it's, we're in an AI world where everything can be done through some kind of, AI. It's still individuals meeting and talking online or in person. And then the decisions are simply made more autonomously than you would typically see.
And so differentiating that from the Wyoming DAO structure from the Delaware law structure. So under Delaware LLC law, it grants a fair degree of flexibility. It's one of the more flexible LLC laws in the country. And in fact, most jurisdictions have adopted something similar to that level of flexibility that Delaware law has. And basically, you can delegate all of those functions to a decentralized group. Wyoming sort of addresses this notion of something that's fully decentralized or a smart contract effectively doing it, which is, I guess, responsive to you vote and then the smart contract carries it out, and there's no executive component that actually has to carry it out. But presumably, Delaware law, you can provide for all of that. What's your view on the advantage of the Wyoming DAO structure as it exists today?
Yeah, I think it's worth comparing also to like how DAOs exist today and where the deficiencies are, right? And I think if you look today at like what are concerns with DAOs like today from like a legal perspective, right? And I think the first one that you would identify is potentially unlimited liability. So, right, so every individual is taking an action. If they're taking an action in their individual capacity, they could then be sued in their individual capacity with no liability protection whatsoever. If you were to take it one step further and say that some aggressive plaintiff's attorney were to want to bring a claim and basically say, this is a partnership amongst all of you, it looks a lot like one, we should treat it that way. Well, partners in a general partnership are all liable for each other's actions. So, if Eric, you get very aggressive and we're both holding the same token, especially in a group where like there are fewer token holders, like there could be an argument made that we are in business together and that I should be liable for your actions. So that's like the first thing that needs to be solved for. The second one is one that's a little more practical, but that's definitely been an issue that DAOs are running into, which is like, okay, so we can interact in the crypto world without any issue. right? Like we can go and send USDC from one to another. Like that's easy. Okay. But now what about when we want to hire a lawyer who says, I want fiat currencies. Oh, and by the way, I want you to sign my engagement letter. Right now, what you see is, and lawyers probably aren't accepting this, but what you'll see in like commercial arrangements is like, X DAO as like the party to that. And you're like, okay, like literally, I don't know who this is that I'm contracting with. And hopefully it's not considered to be a general partnership of all of these token holders on whose behalf I'm acting. And so it's a real mess opening like a bank. How do you open a bank account for a DAO? Like, again, it's one individual that does it. So all of those two issues really being the unlimited liability and like the interaction with the real world are missing in current DAOs. And so then you look at that.
I'll play the devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
So I'm a DAO and I'm like, how do I do all these things? I heard about LLC, but my acronym is DAO. So that doesn't seem, but look, Wyoming has something called DAO. That fits, right? So like, what is, so I know you're getting to it, but what is calling it a DAO structure at the Wyoming level do that can't be done through conventional LLC law?
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly a promise to do more over time, and we both know that. But I'm just putting you on the spot. Like, what do you see as the advantages today? I'm not making it easy on Marc. So.
Yeah, I know. So first, what it does is it introduces the basic things that you would get from any other entity, right? So it's like, okay, we're going to treat this as a limited liability, right, company, which effectively means, okay, now there's limited liability for everybody, right? So you've solved that big issue. Then second of all, it gives a lot of flexibility in how this DAO is effectively managed. Because pretty much what it says is, go ahead and manage it however you want, right? So if you look at it from a Delaware law perspective, what are your choices? Either this is going to be member managed or it's going to be manager managed. And a manager managed, you could think of it like a corporation. You've got your board of directors, right? And so they're going to do that. Okay, well, that's not what we're dealing with a DAO. That being said, when we do start seeing like multi-sigs that are taking actions that, have been voted in by the DAO holders, kind of starts looking like that structure. But let's leave that aside. What you're typically talking about is a member managed entity. And so what Wyoming does, it basically just defaults to, okay, so we automatically have a member managed LLC that we're calling a DAO. And so then you say, okay, well, that literally is exactly what you can do in Delaware. So why is this any better? And then I think once you go like one step deeper and you say, okay, so now how are people going to interact? And how are decisions going to be made, especially when you talk about them being done all electronically, or when you make certain voting decisions where like maybe you have a vote that automatically gets renewed through a smart contract on an annual basis. Again, that's something that you start getting a little bit of lack of clarity under Delaware law if you were to start saying, okay, we as members have decided that, on an annual basis, these people are going to be, or this is the way in which we're going to automatically designate, XYZ action be taken. You start getting some lack of clarity when it's done all electronically under Delaware law that you probably don't have under the Wyoming law. But in reality, that is a tiny little change to Delaware law that basically says you can take any action electronically that you could take in writing, right? Like literally it would be that easy.
Right. And there is no bar on, you can basically delegate any task, any obligation of the member to an entity, or presumably even a process. But to your point, is it's sort of baked in with regards to the Wyoming DAO, whereas in the Delaware LLC law, I guess you have to be there's a lot of flexibility in your operating agreement, so you could arguably provide for that in your operating agreement. And I doubt there'd be an enforceability issue, but to your point, I guess it's the default aspect of the Wyoming DAO.
It's the default. And then when you start getting Delaware LLCs, It is very common, notwithstanding the fact that Delaware courts have been like very good at basically saying you can do whatever you want. They also still go back to look at Delaware corporate law with respect to corporations as to how they apply certain things. So easiest example of this would be fiduciary duties, right? So like there were back in 2010 to 12, there was a lot of debate over how fiduciary duties worked by default in LLCs for Delaware LLCs. And it ends up being essentially the default is what happens with a corporation. But you can opt out of that under Delaware law. And so you can effectively get to what Wyoming did, which is an automatic opt-out of fiduciary duties as they apply to the members. And so when you look at that again, you can achieve it. I think there can be times where there's potential for a court to step in and disagree with something, but ultimately you could pretty much get there. Where I think Wyoming probably, what I think is worthwhile is the defaults that were chosen. So for example, this specific issue is one where there are no fiduciary duties. Like I actually think that's a very important point, given that they operate by default in Delaware. You have to keep in mind that like one of the goals here is to spin something up quickly and efficiently. Now you could argue as to whether you should be spinning up something quickly and efficiently that is going to then manage, billions of dollars in a protocol effectively. But that is the goal. And so getting those defaults right, I think ends up being important. And I think Wyoming largely did that right. I think where Wyoming started pushing the envelope too much on the DAO is trying to make it seem like we live in a world where AI already exists in a meaningful way. They have this concept of algorithmically managed DAOs. That doesn't exist, right? Like a person pushes a button and decides what the button tells the next button, the next part of the program to do, which tells the next part of the program to do. And ultimately, it's a human who decided what the code is doing. I think that when we have real AI that doesn't require humans, this concept of something being algorithmically managed will actually be important, frankly, and will be relevant. We're just not there. And so that put a certain amount of it made the Wyoming law look a little bit gimmicky, frankly, because it's like, okay, you want to talk about this idea of like something being algorithmically managed, but it's not. I think from their perspective, what they're trying to do is to basically say, once a human pushes a button, anything that then happens automatically is algorithmic in nature. And so if you make a decision and you say, hey, this is what's going to happen, and it might be these people are voted to this multi-sig automatically forever, and that's what the code says, then they want to basically be able to say that that's an action that is being taken by software algorithmically. I don't agree with that at all, because somebody pushed the button and somebody can push the button again and undo it potentially, if there's an admin key that allows them to control that.
Right. And full disclosure to the listeners, both Marc and I and others have been in contact with Wyoming legislators regarding the DAO before its adoption. And these points are raised. I think, it is a work in progress with regards to the DAO. And what they implemented, I think, is going to change this notion of choosing algorithmically managed or not. In fact, it's a continuum. In many ways, it's almost a parallel to the sort of decentralization debate. And, because people say, oh, decentralized. No, it's decentral. There's no one's ever 100% decentralized, ever, right? You might be closer or further away from it. You might be closer or further away to algorithmically managed. But this notion that that's actually an end state that you want to achieve, it may be a terrible idea. Like, we shouldn't encourage people to say, yeah, I'm hitting the bid on algorithmically managed, or I'm hitting the bid on fully decentralized. You probably don't want that. And that's probably not even a workable construct completely, from at least a puritanical sense. And then, there's questions about, like, how do you know if it is algorithmically managed that the code is doing what it's supposed to do? Well, presumably you need somebody to audit that, and that's a person, not a machine. So I don't know. Terminator has to go home for a while while I figure out what the code actually does. So
yeah, I do think that one thing that should be pointed out, though, is that what Wyoming's trying to do, that I think is right, or at least I assume they're trying to do, is to make something that is more cost efficient, easier, and more in line with how we're actually like operating DAOs right now, right? And that's why I think like this is actually like a worthwhile effort. Like I think that anybody should be able, without hiring a lawyer, go file a document and create a DAO. And that when that DAO is created, the defaults that are selected and the flexibility with which you can manage it should be something that can be done extremely easily, and that can mostly be done through code that has been written, rather than having to file something that, you know, has maybe a little more complexity to it, although it's not that hard to file a certificate of formation, but nonetheless, like maybe a little more there. But then on top of that, you know, you don't need an LLC agreement. But if you don't have one, understanding the defaults that apply and how they apply in the context of a DAO, like really doesn't actually work, which means you then do need a lawyer. And preparing an LLC agreement in the context of a DAO is not a cheap thing to do, even for lawyers who have already prepared it, because it's going to be so different. And then suddenly you have an LLC agreement and you have somebody who's going to be coding something. So now you need to make sure that the LLC agreement actually matches whatever is going to be coded to carry some of this out. Point is, it's an extremely expensive endeavor. And so it's really trying to put something in place in the way Wyoming's doing to try to cut that down and limit liability for people and allow DAOs to act, in my opinion, is like something we should be striving for.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I mean, I think everybody, or certainly in this space, looks to what Wyoming is doing as they blaze ahead and put a lot of thought into these things and try to get it right, and hopefully act as a template for other states in the country to start to move in that direction. I mean, who knows? Maybe Florida's next, now that they're becoming the Bitcoin capital, right? So shifting gears once again, the last topic to cover is, NFTs. Now, I'm not going to mention any names, but Outlier Ventures proposed a structure for doing NYT SPAs, NFT, not New York Times, non-fungible tokens, purchase agreement, where they have these access tokens that you pay in advance, and then that allows you, once the tokens are released, you get access to them. Looked crazy, like a lot like ICOs from days of yore, thankfully. I know you've seen it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's worth laying like the foundation of, I know when you're talking about NFTs there, and how I'll talk about them is like an NFT that is, let's assume, a piece of art. Okay, let's not talk about an NFT that can be, frankly, almost anything you want it to be, right? So we're talking about effectively a piece of art. And when you look at it like that, to me, that's no different than when you start looking at your equity crowdfunding type campaigns that still exist on, Indiegogo or Kickstarter. Basically, what you're saying is, hey, can you please pay me ahead of time so that I can create this NFT for you? Or in the Kickstarter campaign, pay me ahead of time so that I can create this product for you. There is nothing wrong with that if that's kind of where it ended. And, there are folks that are saying, well, this is effectively a SAFT, and a SAFT doesn't work because it's a simple agreement for future tokens. And that's effectively what you're doing here, but it's an NFT instead of an ERC20 token or some other token. And I would say that, in the Kickstarter situation, basically all you're talking about there is a simple agreement for future product. And you can change that product to token, and now it's a simple agreement for future token. That is not inherently at all a security if you're just pre-buying a product that you want to use. I think where Outlier Ventures goes maybe a step too far is when you start looking at case law, underlying the whole concept of like, well, why isn't this a security? Well, it's the idea that people want to buy it to use it. And so if they want to buy it to use it rather than a typical kind of ERC token that somebody's buying because they want to earn a return based off of somebody's efforts. If you just want to buy it to use it, well, we've got case law that supports that and nothing prevents it, as long as you're not creating some kind of, focus on creating some massive increase in value. And that's where I think things go a little bit wrong in what is being proposed here. When you look at like case law and the SEC discussions around this, the creation of like secondary markets ends up being a really, really important point as to whether something constitutes a security that usually you would think of as, you know, something that you use. That does not mean that just because there is a secondary market, you inherently are going to have a product that is now a security, right? Like baseball trading cards, like they are not considered to be securities just because now there's more efficient secondary markets for trading cards. And so like, I don't think that's an issue. The problem is when you sell it in the context of saying, okay, come buy this product. And by the way, we've also created the secondary market where it can be sold. Now you start having this like push and pull on like, okay, but then why are people buying it? Now suddenly you can't be sure that people are buying it for you. So now you start wondering, okay, are people buying it for investment purposes? And then that's when you really need to dive into like, okay, and so does this meet the Howey test or does it not? And, you know, arguments can be made either way, but in this case, definitely there's some muddied water given that context.
You know, and it's funny with NFTs, you know, one of the things that I struggle with, the Howey test, which we've covered on other episodes of the encrypted economy, is that, you know, particularly with NFTs, when if there, you know, you have more players in the value chain. You might have somebody who's minting the token, you might have somebody who's providing the artwork, and you might have a brand or an artist associated with it, an artist being any artist. And then once it's released, I always get this like, you know, I'm like, yeah, and an NFT is not inherently, in many cases, I mean, you can structure it so it is inherently, but inherently it's not a security. It doesn't have the characteristics. Most of these things don't. I mean, you could have an end run around the securities laws. I think it could raise consumer protection issues, it could raise anti-fraud, AG, all that other stuff. But in terms of it being a security, I said it before, there's no way I see Gensler saying, yeah, this is something we want to stop. I mean, like, really, he's like not going to be wasting his time on this. You know, he doesn't want to be known as the guy who like got into NFTs and couldn't get out. But you know, the challenge is that once you print it out, and now you have like artists, you know, or inexperienced people who are not schooled in securities offering. Let's say they go, you've done everything right. It's perfect the day you release it. And then you release and the artist goes down and says, yeah, you're going to make tons of money on this, guaranteed. It starts pumping it up. And all of a sudden, like everything that you've just created sort of like starts to collapse because now you've turned something that wasn't a security. In some ways, you've now started to morph it into something that is a security. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I give the example all the time when somebody wants to say this thing is not a security. I'm like, I can turn almost anything into a security if I want to, right? And like, I can take Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a security. I can turn it, go bundle up a bunch of Bitcoin, and then go tell somebody, by the way, if you buy this Bitcoin, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. That basically is going to cause the transfer of this bundle of Bitcoin to be worth more than any other Bitcoin and to continue to increase in value, right? So like, there is no reason that you can't create a t-shirt that does that, right? So let's take a artist that wants to take a bunch of shirts and is going to sign those shirts and then sells them and says, by the way, when you buy this shirt, what you now have is you have a promise that every single day I am going to go to a new podcast and I'm going to promote this shirt as much as possible. And I'm going to try to see if I can get it to be worth 5x what it is today. That shirt is not a security. But what you just did was you just wrapped an investment contract around that shirt and you're now selling that investment contract. And so an NFT, in my opinion, is in the context, again, of it being art, it's never going to be a security. But can you wrap an investment contract around that? 100%, you can do that. And I think the more that you communicate a secondary market at the time that you are initially selling an NFT, and I think you start looking more and more like you are creating that investment contract. I think that when you start having separation between the primary platform, the secondary platform where exchange where it's being traded, and like the artist, you start being in a much better spot. You could still have an artist that says, oh, by the way, I'm going to sell my NFT here, and then you're going to be able to exchange it here. And that's what I'm putting together. Okay, that's still a problem. But when you have like an artist and then a separate marketplace and then a separate exchange, and all the artist is doing is saying, hey, by the way, you can come buy my NFT over here. It's going to be awesome. And I'm only releasing 10 of them. That's fine. But when you start tying it to that secondary market really tightly, you start creating different incentives for people. And frankly, we've seen it in this space. It's not that hard to figure out when you see the valuations that we've seen on NFTs.
Yeah, and there's this crazy. I think there's this crazy push and pull between, like, it is such a great vehicle for artists who, let's face it, have been decimated by the failure of the record industry to kind of hold on to this IP. Great if you're Spotify or any of those providers, but like, geez, if you're an artist, particularly a music artist, and you're making money off of concerts, and by the way, that didn't really work very well during COVID, it's rough, right? And so it's a great avenue, but by the same token, these are artists. They didn't go to law school. They're wired differently. And if you put it on a secondary market, I think there's going to be a fair number of mistakes made, where the artists just don't appreciate the significance of what they're doing. So I don't know. It's a weird.
Marketplaces are incentivizing those mistakes, frankly. Actually, they're getting better at it, or at least discussions are being had around it in a more meaningful way. But definitely, like, when you start saying, hey, we're going to split, fees in the secondary market, and by the way, that kind of stuff, like, you're really just inviting like the artist to say like, okay, how can I pump this as much as I can in the secondary market so that it can be worth more and I can make more on it, right? And the second that happens, you've now got an artist who's incentivized to essentially sell a security just because of the way you've created your marketplace. I think that those are issues that, like, look, anytime we get something that's fun, cool, you're going to start going crazy and figuring out where can we push the boundaries. And that's effectively what's been happening. And that's fine. But I think it's going to come back to something that looks closer to, frankly, selling art. And we will have secondary markets that exist. I just think they're going to be less closely linked together.
Yeah. And the odd thing is that, again, before, the record industry gave up the ghost, artists were making royalties on resales of their records and things like that, which they don't have anymore. So arguably, the royalty market gives them a way to subsist better, right? But then there's the flip side where they get engaged. So anyway, we could probably spend another hour talking about that, and we'll have to invite Paris Hilton. I have an invite out, but she hasn't responded yet to come on that. And Lindsay Lohan, she should be easier to get. Oh, I didn't say that, but I did. Anyway, so Marc, it's been great having you on the show. This has been a great discussion. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.